Welcome. We're with the Reverend Kevin Annett, who is the Secretary to the International Tribunal for Crimes of Church and State, who's speaking us from Brantford, Ontario. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Alfred.
Now, I understand that you've been, over the last several days, starting on October 1st, 2011, at the oldest Indian residential school in Canada, which in fact was set up by the Anglican Church in 1832 to imprison and destroy generations of Mohawk children, and which functioned as an Indian residential school until quite recently in 1970. Now, there have been a series of historical developments there over the past several days, and I wondered if you could bring our audience up to date on that.
It is very historic, Alfred, and I really appreciate our interview because, as listeners may not realize, this story has been completely blacked out in the Canadian media. The only people to contact me are people like you and alternative media. The so-called mainstream media are reporting the fact that for the first time in Canadian history, graves have been opened at an Indian residential school, and that we have conclusive evidence now from ground-penetrating radar that massive amounts of soil were deliberately dumped on graves where children are buried. And that evidence has appeared over the last 6 days. As you mentioned, October 1st, we began digs in conjunction with, and this is really important to note, I didn't simply end up here. I was invited in April by 9 elders of the Mohawk Nation to come here at their invitation. The clan mothers invited me. Now, these are people outside the government band council system. These are traditional elders who for years have been struggling to get the truth of what happened at the mush hole, as they call it, the Indian residential school here. They call it the mush hole because that's what children were often forced to eat, this maggoty mush, and survivors refer to it as that. But on the grounds of the school, we've already mapped 5 areas where there's definitely mass graves. We've begun excavations which have been indicated, bone fragments and other things, which we're in the process of having analyzed this week. But what's significant about all this is that we were invited in to specifically get evidence to indict Canada and the Church of England for crimes against humanity. And fortunately, this is starting a wave across the country. We've already heard from indigenous groups in the Maritimes, the Maliseet people, the Manitoba, and of course the Squamish Nation on the west coast of British Columbia. And they all plan to go ahead and start conducting their own forensic and investigations and their own archaeological digs to bring their children home. That's something you hear all the time here now from the people on the dig. We're doing this to give the children final recognition and bringing them home. And so this is really flying in the face of the government cover-up, known as the TRC, the attempt to simply whitewash this thing. Well, that's not possible now that since the commencing of these digs.
Now, you've stated that more than half of the children imprisoned at the Mohawk Institute never returned to their families, and many of them are buried all around the school. Why is it that children would be buried? Why is it that children are dying there?
Well, there's 2 general reasons. First of all, as in every residential school, the schools were set up under the cover of education to simply exterminate the younger generation of Native people. The primary way they did that was through germ warfare, and this has been well documented in my work at Hidden No Longer. You can download all my research and read it from government documents, where the 50% death rate is talked about openly by Dr. Bryce, who was the government Indian Affairs doctor in 1909, who documented all this. But the general point was to use germ warfare to depopulate strategic areas of the country, especially the West, after the 1880s when the railway opened up the area and they needed to get natives off the land quick. But here in the East, this school was very significant. It was the prototype. It was the very first school that the Catholic and Anglicans established test out methods of fascinating people. For example, one of the things that the underneath the school, tunnels and chambers and psychics, they have been, children were being tortured to death, and they were being tried out on children here. Now, according to some of these records are kept in the and these are some of the access to confirm that residential school. It was a place, and students has recently described, for example, to their neck, if they tried to being killed for taking an apple in this place, and significant that we're finally doing the next excavation.
Yes, could
begin to turn out.
Right. Could we just pause a second, Kevin?
Yes.
Now, Kevin, we have heard of atrocities being committed at the school. Eyewitnesses who've said that kids have been beaten and killed for taking apples off of trees. Now, if we have a rate that half of the children did not return, these are genocidal atrocities. Given what you've talked to eyewitnesses, could you describe what you think were the atrocities that went on at the school?
Well, like I mentioned before, the Mohawk school was a special case. It was a prototype where they brought children in deliberately to experiment on them. The attempt to depopulate the Mohawks during the 1800s was a political move as well, because there was an attempt, just a little bit of background for people, the area around Brantford was called the Haldimand Tract, from a treaty in 1784 where the British granted 1 million acres to the Mohawk Confederacy because they had been allies against Americans in the Revolutionary War. This is a vast swath of land west of Toronto, going down into the Niagara Peninsula. Presently, the Mohawks only have 4% of that land base left, acres out of the original 1 million. And the reason during the 1800s they lost so much land is they were targeted for extermination. Well, that residential school was brought in the very same year that the city of Brantford was incorporated and began to cut into native land. So clearly, this was not only a prototype to figure out, what's the most effective way to wipe out native culture, but it had a political purpose right in that area too. So because of that, the Mohawks have very well documented what happened to their children. And looking over the records held by the tribunal people, it's really clear that they were doing things, like rounding up children en masse, deliberately starving them, using them, in indefinite pedophile rings. As a matter of fact, Mohawk children were deliberately trafficked by the Lieutenant Governor of Canada, Major John Colborne, and all of his associates. They talk about that in some of the diaries, how easy it was for them to obtain children from the Mohawk school. And so what's really clear is that over the century and a half that the school operated, they were, some of the local Mohawks have described how they have stories of children going into these underground chambers and never coming out again. And what's interesting is that the local government-sponsored band council is extremely paranoid about anyone going into the building and looking through records that are still held there. There was on 2 occasions people tried to go in there as Mohawk people and look at those records, and they'd been threatened with arrest. And when the Woodland Cultural Center next to the Mohawk School was opened in 1972, when they first began to build it, they found skeletons on the ground, the construction site. Those skeletons disappeared overnight, and people were instructed never to talk about it. The same thing happened in 2008. I mean, as recently 3 years ago, these skeletons are appearing, and yet they disappear, and all the staff were told not to talk about it. Well, that's the kind of classic Canadian cover-up that is, embodied in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But, this has been going on for many years, especially here in Brantford.
Right. Now, you mentioned that it was that the Mohawk Institute was set up by the Anglican Church in England. Did the Anglican Church operate it the entire time from 1832 till its closing in 1970?
That's right. There was the Church of England, the Anglican Church, but don't forget that there was close collaboration with the Roman Catholics in the operation of the school. Numerous children described Catholic dignity to respect the school. There was a lot of collaboration, just like there is now between the churches and their legal defense strategies. So the Catholic Church played a strong hand in this school as well.
Well, I'm thinking that the head of the Anglican Church is in fact the British Crown, the monarch, who is the head of state of Canada, both of the UK and of Canada, and the head of the Roman Catholic Church, of course, is the Pope. And do you think that both of these heads of state, one head of state, the monarch of England, and the other entity, the Pope, do you think that they had working knowledge that this program of depopulation, of killing more than half the children at this school?
Well, that's what, two things on that. First of all, we know for a fact that a lot of the records are held in London, in the Privy Council office. That was, in fact, told to me when I went to the National Archives in Ottawa several years ago. I tried to access the experimental programs that were done in the Indian hospitals across Canada. I was told that in 1999, all records related to Indian hospitals had been officially sealed. And I said to the librarian, well, what does that mean? She said, you need security clearance, and I tried doing that and was told that it was all held in the Privy Council office in London. And I thought, well, that's really odd. What is it doing over in London? Well, this is the Crown of England, how they rule directly. Canada, the Privy Council office is the body in Canada that passes a lot of the laws. They have kind of like the main jurisdiction over Canadian laws, and they're the ones holding these records. So I've also had sources in the Vatican refer to a lot of the experimental programs done on children all over the world through, Catholic agencies and that, again, are held in the Vatican Library. So the final piece on that is that there was a Mohawk seer, somebody who is very sensitive and was able to touch objects and get impressions and that kind of thing, actually being used in criminal investigations by the local police here. This man told me that he had seen underground chambers in the Brantford School, in the Mohawk Institute, where priests in red robes were conducting ritual sacrifice of children, and that documents related to what they uncovered about how to control and torture children, most effectively, those are held in the Vatican in a vast area that he perceived. So, kind of in the Vatican Library. So, no, I believe definitely these records exist, and what's significant in Canada is that when this kind of bogus Truth and Reconciliation Commission began to operate, they said that they were not going to subpoena, and they didn't have the power to subpoena records from the churches. The churches had to voluntarily submit, the evidence of what people were talking about when children being harmed and killed. So, what corporation in the world, their lawyers are going to allow incriminating evidence and documents to be shared before a commission of inquiry? Obviously, they're not. So, in order to get these records, this is why we set up our own tribunal. We're going to have to do it ourselves. And just a kind of final note on that, in the last week that I've been here, a lot of these, the records held and documents held by people in this community being brought forward. There's a tremendous coming together of the community here in Brantford. People are out at the dig site. They're offering information. They're coming forward. Even people on the government funded by council have come forward and publicly said they support this dig. And, the ground penetrating radar surveys we're doing around the school and that. So there's, it's really activating the community. And they've said to the RCMP, we're not going to let you on our ground to declare it a crime site. This is our crime site, our investigation.
Well, with the ground penetrating radar, could you describe some of the preliminary findings, even over this past first week of the excavations at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford?
Yes, I can tell you, first of all, we surveyed a lot of the land just to the side of the building where eyewitnesses said a lot of children were buried. And what the ground GPR technician has said is that it's clear from the initial survey that the soil was dislocated. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, they brought in a lot of dirt and covered these graves. And that's a direct quote from the technician. Clearly, they were trying to cover these graves. That happened right around 1970 when they closed the school. This is, eyewitnesses said these hills weren't there before then. So they've reconstructed the whole grounds of the school by burying these graves under 15 or 20 feet of soil. Another thing we found is definite subterranean tunnels. These areas run around the side of the building, and they're quite old. And we've also found that the graves are much more extensive than we realized initially. That's the radar survey. The actual grave sites that we began to excavate, there's sinkholes all over the woods to the west of the school. And these were not woods originally, they were cornfields, but there were definite sinkholes and other vegetation which suggests a lot of graves in that area. So we expect that there to be, once we start excavating in a serious way and get the archaeological teams in here to do the professional job on it, we're probably going to uncover the remains of hundreds, if not, over 1,000 children here.
Now, how is this going to fit into the proceedings at the International Tribunal for crimes of church and state?
This evidence that we're accumulating is going to be right high up on the agenda of the ICCCS forums that are actually commencing during October in Brussels and in Dublin. We've been locked out of London for now. Not only myself but others have been barred from entering England. The Crown of England is extremely worried and paranoid about this stuff, and they're simply not letting our people into the country. Well, that's all right. We operate through the internet and other means to people who are within England. They're going to be holding those forums with information we're sending them. And in Dublin and Brussels, we're convening forums. We're going to be bringing this before politicians in the European Parliament who have pledged that they're going to use this to justify a international investigation to indict Canada and the Catholic and Anglican United Church of Canada for against humanity. So that's already in the works. And this evidence from the Mohawk Institute is going to be very key to that because it shows that this was a conspiracy from day one in Canada, a criminal conspiracy starting at the very first Indian residential school run by Church Jan Faith.
Right. Now, the scale of this genocide is so extraordinary, and you've mentioned aspects of it that are very disturbing, such as priests in red robes torturing children and perhaps engaging in ritual murder, which suggests what we generally call satanic rites. Do you believe that there were in fact these covert satanic rites going on here?
Well, I mean, as the evidence turns up, we'll be able to tell once we find human remains and do forensic studies. There's a lot of ways to determine cause of death, and thing is, it's like other sorts of interesting evidence starts to surface. For example, I had a woman come to me here who hadn't thought about this diary her father had given her like over 40 years ago that he had kept in the school, and she offered it to us the other day. And you know, it makes reference to incidents that he saw about they had a rack in the basement where they used to strap children to, and literally stretch them like a medieval rack. Now, all of these things indicate these medieval practices come from a certain mentality in the Church of England. The body that ran this residential school was called the New England Society. It was set up in 1649 in England. It was the very first missionary society in England. And they set up this school in Bradford and one other one, the St. George's Anglican School in Lytton, British Columbia. Now, at the Lytton School, when we held our first tribunal in Vancouver in 1998, an employee there described, and I have letters confirming this, where the principal described the children being manacled after they had run away, brought back in chains to the school, put in a public stock, and flogged to death. Now, these are punishments the Crown of England reserved for traitors. You know, you flog them publicly, you put them in a public stocks, you treat them like criminals. That's coming out of a certain mindset, right out of the Middle Ages, that says, you know, these children are not human and they have the right to be tortured and killed. Well, I mean, that's a direct indictment of the Crown of England and its methods, and the Vatican, its inquisitorial methods. And so, you know, all of these things point to something much more deep and hideous than the Canadian media will ever even suggest, because of their deliberate plan to collude with the government and the churches in making this whole thing seem very benign, as if it was a few bad priests harming a few children, as the Pope put it once. You know, he expressed regret that some children had been harmed by some priests. That's the big lie being put out there to cover up this genocide.
Well, you know, I can't but help but make a connection between the testimony of, I believe, William Coombs, is it?
Yes.
That in October of 1964, at the other end of the country, in Kamloops, BC, as at a residential school, he was an eyewitness to the head of state of Canada, Elizabeth Windsor, and her consort, Prince William, going to a residential school and picking out 10 young Aboriginal children and taking them away on a supposed picnic, but they were never seen again in their lives. And it strikes me that this may have been with the head of state of Canada, Elizabeth Windsor, also being the head of the C of E, the head of the Church of England, which was the founding body and the operating body of the Mohawk Institute, and that in fact the British monarchy is engaged in a series of programmatic genocides, which also have a kind of a ritualistic, and I'm going to use the word again, satanic, or yes, you know, we've been cut off 4 times so far, but I'm going to repeat the question, and that is that there seems to be a parallel between the testimony of eyewitness William Coombs, who saw in 1964 the head of state of Canada, and also the head of the C of E, the head of the Church of England, which is Elizabeth Windsor. And in 1964, October, Elizabeth Windsor and her consort were seen eyewitness to having taken 10 young Aboriginal children from a residential school to a alleged picnic, but the children were never seen again. And that is the head of the Anglican Church. So now we have the evidence that from 1832 to 1970, i.e. in 1964, this program was still going, we have a genocidal program in the same institution, the Anglican Church, which has disappeared more than half of the children at the Mohawk Institute. So it seems to me that the throne of England, in its role as the head of the Anglican Church, there's a parallel here. There's genocide occurring on the west coast of Canada in the same institution, and there's genocide occurring in the Ontario area. I mean, this is a criminal genocidal institution.
That's right, and also we should mention that William Coombs, just on the verge of him coming to England to give testimony about this, he died suddenly in a Vancouver hospital after he had a coma induced deliberately through injections at St. Paul's Hospital, a Catholic hospital in the West End. And then after less than 2 days, he was pulled off the life support system at the Vancouver General Hospital. Before his condition could even be diagnosed, he was deliberately murdered by having his life support system terminated. So again, that's not accidental. It's getting rid of a witness, and that tells you a lot right there.
Yeah, so that here you mentioned that the Mohawks now have only 4% of the 1 million acres that were granted to them under a treaty by the British because of their cooperation in a war against the U.S. Now, it seems to me that the functions of this genocide were to grab that land, and to genocide the race, and to perform evil satanic rituals. I mean, you as a clergyman know about this.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting because when just a little anecdote which shows you how widespread this is in the church. When I went to Port Alberni in 1992, and I began as minister at St. Edward's United Church, at the very first Presbyterian meeting I was at, there was an older United Church minister who came over to me, and he made a statement to me, jokingly, that, well, if you want a child, it's easy to get one around here. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, Indian kids are easy to get. And I just looked at him like he was odd, and it was almost like he was putting out a feeler to see if I was interested. But that's at my first Presbyterian gathering. They're talking about trafficking Indian children. That was in the fall of 1992 in Nanaimo. So, I mean, it shows you how all-pervasive this mentality and this culture is within these churches. And that's a supposedly more liberal denomination in Canada, not the Roman Catholic Church. So I would say, yeah, there's this whole underground culture of torture and abuse within these Christian churches. And, the best example of that, just this week, Alfred, a story came out, and it should surface soon, about how women are systematically being raped by staff members at First United Church on East Hastings. I knew from homeless people there that the United Church was abusing them. But women are actually being raped there, and the church gets away with it. The United Church minister there has just hired a known sex offender on staff, and nothing's done about it. This is a whole pattern in the churches, and it comes from that whole genocidal history. They know they can get away with it.
Well, for those of us in the listening audience who are not totally familiar with the term trafficking in children and what the uses to which these children at the residential schools were put, quote, trafficking children, for example, when they said it's easy to get, quote, end of quote, an Indian child. What does trafficking in children entail? Could you paint the picture for us, please?
Well, a number of ways. And one of the groups I'm working for is looking to do adoption mothers in these run by Catholic United others. These mothers physical pressure and battering to children while they're still pregnant with them. Not fit mothers that other families could be. The Catholic Church especially is involved in deliver these babies to adopt money. That's one form of it. Overt. We've had the BC social service system innocence in 19.
Kevin, okay, we've experienced an extraordinary amount of outside interference by what I would call the national security state. In this interview, I've rarely have experienced at this level. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left in the interview. Could you please summarize what you think the significance of your finding is now?
Well, it's the start of a whole trend across Canada where for the first time the survivors of this genocide are putting the government and churches on trial, and they're taking steps themselves to find the final piece of missing evidence, the forensic proof of the murder of these children. It's a tremendously important step, and it's going to spread. We've already had indications that Native people across Canada are going to start doing their own digs and ignore the TRC and the government and the churches, and actually turn the tables on these bodies and not be victims anymore. So it's very important, and it's important for all Canadians to get on board and support them. I'd urge people to contact the Ganata Center here in Brantford, where the group is working out of. The phone number is 519-757-3624. To contact us at itccs.org, the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, itccs.org, and contact me at hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and we look forward to your continuing reports as more and more finds and evidence of this gross genocide going up to the very head of state of Canada, the head of the Anglican Church, and the head of the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. We'll give you updates very soon as we discover more. Thank you.
Certainly. This is Alfred Weber. We've been with Reverend Kevin Annett, who is the Secretary of the International Tribunal for Crimes of Church and State. I'm Alfred Weber. Please stay tuned. Thank you.